if I can pre-generate everything, I will. If I can't pre-generate everything, but I can use serverless environments to help, I will. And if I can't use serverless environments, but I can add a server, I will. And it's exactly as you just described. It's like, start at the simplest thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, it's the robustness principle, right? I mean, it's the same. It's the design principle for the web, just applied to all of architecture.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.
Welcome to the next episode of What the Jam. Today I'm here with Phil Hawksworth, who is a long-time Netlify employee. He's the principal developer experience engineer. He's been heavily involved with Jamstack, and really excited to have him here today.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've been watching some of the others as well, and just been finding it fascinating. So so thanks for having me along.
Of course, I've been excited for this one too. So let's start off. What does Jamstack mean to you?
Oh my God, that's a nice easy question, right? Nice and simple. So for me, it's always been the core of it. It's a fancy way of talking about static sites plus. I have to say, I loved Zach's answer to this question when you were talking in the panel, where he said, a folder full of files, which, apart from the alliteration being lovely, that really is the heart of it, I think. So, portable static assets that you can serve from a variety of places simply. That's, for me, the core of what Jamstack is. And of course, it's got a little bit more complicated than that over the time, but that's what it really means to me, and that's what I tend to embrace.
Yeah, no, we kind of found that in the panel. That's like where we're kind of circling around, and it's a really elegant way of saying it. Maybe we go back a bit and talk about how you got into the Jamstack.
Why not? So as you mentioned, kind of in your introduction there, I've been at Netlify for a few years. I think it's 6 and a bit years now I've been at Netlify. Before then, I used to work at agencies. So I'd been a software developer for a long time, and kind of gradually worked my way around different companies, different places. But I did about 9 years at agencies. And the most recent one was a kind of a large marketing branding agency called RGA, who kind of a big global company. And we used to build sites and experiences for all kinds of big global brands and companies. And I was a tech director there, which meant that I was kind of leading the engineering work on these different campaigns and different projects. Usually it meant that we would pitch an idea, and then the tech director would have to go and talk to the technical team of the company and say, right, this is how we'll build it. And then they'll go, no, you use our stack and use our platform. And so trying to marry the needs of a project with the constraints of a platform and the technology was always, that's where the craft happened. That's where the compromises were made. That's where the tricky stuff was going on. Very often I found that the things that we were pitching actually could have a way more simple technical stack than was being offered, that would just make it simpler for us to build it, maintain it, and all the rest of it, and keep our costs predictable. And so I got very enamored by this idea of pre-generating sites, using some kind of build step, automating that as much as possible, and then having just some assets that we could host anywhere in a very predictable way. And that became like the core of my interest in, what later was to become like known as Jamstack, but previously had been, I don't know, maybe called static hosting.
Yeah.
But the thing that I really found was that if you're dealing with like a Google or a Nike or a Beats by Dre, and you say, oh yeah, we've got this amazing concept for you, it's going to be a static site, they go, no, because that sounds boring, because the static word sounds really dull. And so I was quite excited when I got into conversations with Matt and Chris, my co-founders of Netlify, when they started talking about trying to remarket that a little bit and find another term that would just be a bit more palatable, which ultimately is where this term came from. In many ways, it was a marketing term, not just to help Netlify talk about their offering, but also to help people have a vocabulary for an approach to building the sites that, frankly, was just a little bit overlooked and thought to be dull. I think of static as a huge virtue rather than a limitation, because if you can have static assets, you've got this incredible set of opportunities for the way that you can host it, have a workflow around it, and all the rest of it. So I became very keen on using this term to talk to customers, to clients, then to say, oh yeah, we can build this experience for you. It'll be a Jamstack site, and often they'd go, well, what's that? And then you just start describing it. It just helped you get past that.
Yeah.
I don't know, that slight kind of bad smell there used to be around the word static assets, which I just don't think was justified, and comes from, it's just a slight misnomer, really. It just kind of leads you to think that it's the experience is static rather
Exactly.
than what your approach. So I found myself really kind of advocating for this approach for building sites, and ended up kind of doing little meetup talks about it, conference talks about it, and before you know it, whenever I would point at a tool that was useful for it, whether it was Surge, don't know if you remember Surge,
Yeah, the hosting
or yeah,
provider.
exactly, yeah, and there's a library as well. I believe they're still going, actually.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Harp when I think about the
Yeah.
library, but Surge, Harp, BitBalloon as it was then, which was then to become Netlify. So whenever I talk about these things at conferences, people would get quite excited about it and go, "Oh, that looks kind of interesting." And before you know it, that's how I got into the conversation with the folks at Netlify, and ended up going and doing the same kind of job there, just talking about that approach. But my interest really came from looking for ways to simplify, just so that I could get the job done, to be very honest. And don't know what your experience has been, but I found the larger the company, the larger the brand, the less likely they are to say, "Oh yeah, a nice, simple,
Yeah.
relatively cheap and approachable way of hosting it is far preferable to the things that we've spent, invested maybe hundreds of millions of dollars on sometimes." So it became a little bit of a tricky one. But ultimately, when I found the opportunity to build sites that way, that's where I had the most success. So yeah, I just got more and more interested in that over time.
Yeah. No, I think that point is interesting because it's for a big company, it's like it couldn't possibly be that easy. Like we're big and we need big platforms.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of ended up finding that clients very often liked solutions that were reassuringly expensive.
Yeah.
Because if it's the really big expensive one that's trusted by other large companies, then that must be the right thing to do, because it's expensive for a reason. And it doesn't just come down to cost, obviously, but that became a difficult emotional shift, or a psychological shift, for particularly large brands to adopt something that was simpler. But in the, I don't know, 6-8 years or so since I was really kind of working on that, I found that the attitudes have changed somewhat. Not universally,
Mm.
but to a large extent. Lots of companies are starting to see the benefits of a slightly different approach, no matter what it's called. And we'll maybe get into names in a little bit, but moving away from a model where they host application servers and web servers and all of that infrastructure, whether they're physical or virtual. Just getting away from that notion has been something that I've seen that trend happening. And I don't really need to explain the architecture quite so
Mm.
much as I used to. It used to be like, whoa, what a huge paradigm shift. And I was trying not to let on that, yeah, we always used to do it this way back in the day. It's like some of the tools that have enabled different processes around it. But yeah, people seem much more at ease with that model now, even if the terms that describe it kind of come and go.
Mm. So how did you see that evolving from this tooling around static sites like Jekyll and things
Yeah.
in early 2010s to Jamstack to it becoming a paradigm that everyone's familiar with and a lot more buy-in from uh, I guess the whole spectrum of use cases and sizes of
Yeah.
company.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's been a bit of an arc to it for sure. Um, and I think, yeah, as you say, the tools have really evolved. So it used to be nice and simple thinking about the ways that it would work, because ultimately there were build tools that generated assets that were static, and it became quite well understood the water's being muddied a little bit with this kind of notion of, well, is a Jamstack site, is that an SPA? Is that a client side rendered thing? Because there's a capital J right at the beginning of the word, so
Yeah.
everything has to be JavaScript, which I think is a bit problematic.
Yeah.
I kind of like the term, but it's strewn with problems, really, because strictly speaking, it's not a stack, and you don't need JavaScript, and you don't need APIs. I mean, the things that you really need is some markup, and that's kind of it. Which
Yeah.
is where I get to quite enjoy the phrase that Zach had about it's a file of folders. But anyway, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But yeah, as the tooling evolved and got more powerful, and the developer experience got more compelling, and the friction for deploying got lower, then I think it really started to gain a lot of adoption. And I think it's the tooling that really is the distinction between the days of old where it
Yeah.
was a bunch of assets on a server. That's nice and easy to comprehend. But how do you get them there in the first place in the deployment process? And that's the thing that excited me and got me really into it. And I guess it was probably Jekyll that might have been one of the instigators for me, when I could really see a very tangible way of turning some templates and some data into a bunch of assets, which were a website that I could put anywhere. And this kind of word portable comes back again. But just the lower the friction in creating that site in the first place and then deploying it, the more compelling it got, which is why I ended up making really stupid examples and demos to prove a point about how little friction there is in deploying it. Because I think Jamstack sites, these kind of pre-generated sites, are very compelling when there's no friction to deploying it. Whereas traditional sites, often there is a lot more friction in deploying things, but they can be more dynamic between deploys, because there's application code that runs at request time. But no, I found myself kind of making silly examples like a clock that redeploys
Yeah. I
every
love that
minute of
one.
the day, which I ran for longer than I should have done, actually, because it ended up being the subject of lots of examples and lots of talks. But I turned that off so that I could. Well, I started using a different method for doing that in the end that had a better carbon footprint than redeploying every minute, which is fine for an example, but you don't want to run that forever, because that's not the most responsible thing in the world.
Yeah. Well, if you take it a step further and you're like, okay, we're just going to dynamically render that every time. Now you've got that carbon footprint, not every hour, but every request.
Exactly. And I know that there are caching layers and things like that people put in place to try and mitigate that. But yeah, I mean, I wish I had better data around the carbon footprint of a high traffic site that has a large variety of URLs that justify it being dynamic, versus something which is, rendered differently, where it's pre-generated and maybe got a long tail of requests that are being built using ISR or ODB or what other acronyms you want to throw at it for kind of a long tail of a build, where the last few assets get cached, the first time they're requested. I'd love to be able to actually see the comparison, but of course, in reality, it's really hard to do because we're sitting on top of a bunch of different hosting providers, closer to the metal. So it's a little bit harder to do, but notionally, it seems to me that ought to be far more efficient and energy efficient than particularly at scale, when you've got a lot of traffic having to do these things every single time.
Big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that particular thing is something I'm thinking about a lot. And
Yeah.
just at a high level, like an Nginx box, pretty small, like EC2 instance, that can handle something like 10 or 20,000 requests per second. But when you stick PHP or some sort of dynamic processing in there, that number goes down to hundreds. And I'm trying to come up with a fair test to show that, and then from there you can kind of take the step up to carbon emissions of okay, we can do 10,000 a second here, we can do 100 here. So what does that look like if we want to serve 1 million customers in a day?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm very interested in kind of challenging those traditional models. And for many types of sites, I think we've had that argument quite successfully. But is always in pushing that boundary and saying, well, what actually is feasible? What actually is a reasonable thing to use with this model? I'm very cautious of ever saying this is the way you should build all websites forever.
Yeah.
That's because I'll always defend the right of someone to say it depends, because then that elicits the question, well, what does it depend on? And then you have a conversation, and then in order to be able to make a recommendation, you have to have that discussion. So understanding what you're building is is obviously one of the most important things for choosing the tools and the approach in the first place. But it kind of gets overlooked because we as developers love fun, shiny toys that are fun to build with. And if it solves the problem, then great. But I think it sometimes needs a bit more analysis of how it's solving it, and if it's solving it the right way. Because it works is fine, but does it work appropriately? I think that really matters as well. So yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down.
Yeah, it's like if you're buying a car, you're going to have certain parameters you're looking for. Maybe it's fuel efficiency, maybe it's safety, maybe you just want a fun car, and then you've kind of got these high level decisions to make of electric, hybrid, or just gas, or maybe even hydrogen or something these days. Hydrogen. And you can, well, I'm not like super into cars, so I can talk at a high level about the trade-offs of those.
See where our metaphor breaks down as between as we show our ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's about the trade-offs of all those different approaches, right? And which is the set of trade-offs that makes the most sense for what I'm looking for a car. Like I think we need that with approaches as well.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. I mean, yeah, you can get a nice big minibus. You can get loads of people in that, but can you park it on your driveway? And how many are you in the family? I've been one of the challenges I've had a number of times when I've been giving a talk about a certain approach, where I've kind of shown how you can do certain dynamic things with various different serverless runtimes and other different approaches to rendering and what have you. And people said, yeah, that's fine, but you wouldn't build Amazon.com with that, would you? And which is fair. I don't think you would. But usually my response to that is, are you building something like Amazon.com? And usually it's someone who's building a marketing site or something that's got, it's a shopping site that's got 100 SKUs on it or something like that. And it's just, being absolutist is really something I'm very cautious about, which is why maybe I'm always nervous about the conversations about, well, what is Jamstack? Because it has become a little bit amorphous, which I think is one of the problems, to be very honest, as the definitions got broader, as the technologies behind it have evolved. That's muddied the waters somewhat, I think.
Yeah, so let's dive into that. Like, I feel like that the starting point of that expansion was serverless and like DPR and ISR, which I think is a really important technology because you're making this trade-off between, do I have to do a build of the whole site, which for some static site generators might take hours, or do I just build the core part, and the first time a request is made to a certain route, render that dynamically once, and then it's static. Like we need that technology.
Yeah.
But it also kind of created this opening to like, okay, if that's Jamstack, then this other stuff is Jamstack. How did you see that, like kind of living through it?
Well, I think so. I might be the frog in the pot that gradually it was getting warmer around me a little bit, because even when, as you're describing that and saying like serverless might have been the first part to that, I was kind of nodding along and agreeing, because I remember getting a demo of Netlify functions, which was the first attempt by Netlify to bring serverless functions into the same workflow and the same kind of paradigm, and kind of create that utility for developers. I was very, very excited about it because it meant that I could build with Lambda functions and serverless functions in the same way that I was already doing for other things. And so that definitely feels like a bit of an inflection point where the boundaries are starting to get blurred a little bit. But when I think about it, there are actually things that are blurring the boundaries even before then, because if we are going to be purists about it, and I don't know if we should or not, but for the sake of simplicity, if we are going to say, well, Jamstack sites are a folder of files that you can serve from anywhere, which might be oversimplifying it, but I kind of like it.
Mm.
Then there are things that I'd been doing on Netlify for a while that maybe already blur that boundary a little bit, because there are things such as the redirects API. So on Netlify, you can put a bit of config in your kind of route, and it will shape the traffic and do redirects and what have you. Well, that's something that's happening at request time. That's config. Well, I mean, it's configuration, it's shaping traffic, but it's already getting you a little bit beyond just serving static assets. You could argue, well, that's analogous to just like an Apache config that's kind of adding some. Either way, it's just starting to nibble at the edges a little bit. And I hadn't really thought about that at the time, but the more I kind of reassess it, we're already in that road. But certainly the serverless, the introduction of serverless functions there, and then the way that we at Netlify started talking about that, I think that was starting to blur the boundaries somewhat. And I think one of the core things that happens here is that and when I say we, I don't mean you and me or we at Netlify. I'm talking about everyone who's kind of in this kind of category. We sometimes conflate what Jamstack is with the benefits and the behaviors you get from using it.
Mm.
So, for instance, we could say that Jamstack is immutable atomic deploys. I don't know if that's entirely true. I think it's just that if you have a folder of files, that means that you get afforded this experience of having immutable atomic deploys. You get the affordance of being able to put those things onto a CDN very readily. I think there's some of the conversation. I think it was in the panel again with Zach and Brian and Cassidy and Salma talking about CDN and like debating is that one of our pillars, CDN? And I don't think it is. I think it's something that you get afforded very comfortably by embracing something which is the simplistic set of, here's some static assets, along with like the automated builds, the sensible defaults for caching behavior, and all of those things. I don't think those are Jamstack. I think those are benefits that you unlock by a Jamstack approach. It's kind of a subtle difference, and it feels like we're arguing semantics a little bit, but I think by conflating some of the behaviors you get and the benefits that you get afforded with the actual thing itself, then that's when things can spiral out of control.
I completely agree.
Okay. Yeah. And it extends to JavaScript as well, right? Because a JavaScript asset is a static asset that you can just stick in a folder and then serve. But the behaviors you get from that, then I think it's dangerous if we start to loop those back in. And I think that's where a lot of confusion has come about Jamstack, just thinking, oh, well, it's a single page application. And here are the reasons single page applications are bad, we think. And that becomes then a critique of Jamstack itself rather than a single page application. Because I'm a very cautious JavaScript. I mean, I'm a JavaScript developer is my background. That's what I just kind of talk about, how I describe myself. But I'm very cautious about how much JavaScript I add and where and when and why. And it comes back to it depends every time for me.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good stuff there to unpack. I want to start with the redirects that you're talking about, because I think when you start looking closer and closer, you're like, well, what does static even mean? Like, I have a proxy in front of my server which is running code on every request. Like, does that mean it's no longer static? Or now I have an iframe which is pointing to a Google map, which is rendering stuff dynamically from a Google server. Is that static? My website's static and it's portable, but it's referencing stuff that's not static. So it's like there's even within static, there's a spectrum of staticness.
Completely.
And it can be hard to draw that circle.
I do agree, and I think this kind of feeling that the work has been done and you're just trying to deliver
Yeah,
the thing is the crux of it. But even when we think about you know, JavaScript APIs and markup as unquestionably where Jamstack came from, right? I mean, there's the acronym. That's how it was all described. Um, Not everything there is static because APIs typically are
yeah,
you're calling an API where something dynamic is happening, but it's the decoupling. It's the
yeah,
fact that in my as the developer and the owner of this kind of web estate, you can hand off the responsibility for the dynamic pieces to elsewhere and call on those services. So it's just I just don't think there's much productive argument in saying, well, nothing in the paradigm is, or everything in the paradigm is static. Nothing is dynamic. It's where are the boundaries and where are the responsibilities.
yeah,
Um, that for me at least, I think that's kind of core. But as soon as you start going down that's like variable route and where's the handoff, it starts to become difficult to define, which I think is that's just the nature of the beast.
yeah.
Sadly,
And that's where I've been thinking about this idea of static first. Like static
yeah,
should be the default. And then if you're starting with a dynamic site, let's say you have a WordPress site, it's like, what's one step to making that more static? Okay, add a cache and CDN in front of it. What's another step? Okay, swap out Postgres for SQLite. What's another step? Have a
right,
plugin that basically clones the site as a static version, and now you've basically made that site as static as it can be. So
yeah,
it's more about a journey, and if you're starting from scratch, start from static, and when you cross the line to more dynamic things, make that a conscious choice, not just
yeah.
okay, I start with like dynamic rendering and because I'm going to build Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with that approach. I mean, I think that's the best way to make conscious decisions to opt into things and like turn things on when you need them. Is I mean, it's not progressive enhancement, but it feels a little bit like it's a progressive enhancement mindset for your entire stack, where you start with the simplest thing and you gradually layer them on. And I just think that's good form for being um, deliberate about your architectural choices. I got into some back and forth on Twitter a while ago. Obviously, that's where the best reasoned, sensible debate happens. Kind of about this and whether or not it's sensible to have a server or not. And again, I'm just really cautious about being absolutist. And so,
Yeah,
my position was, if I can pre-generate everything, I will. If I can't pre-generate everything, but I can use serverless environments to help, I will. And if I can't use serverless environments, but I can add a server, I will. And it's exactly as you just described. It's like start at the simplest thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, it's the robustness principle, right? I mean, it's the
mm,
same. It's the design principle for the web, just like
it's a good point.
applied to all of architecture. And so, yeah. So anyway, I'm saying a lot of words, but ultimately, I'm just nodding aggressively at what you just said. I think that's really the approach to take.
Yeah,
And you can go much further with fewer things than we might once have imagined. And the tooling has got better and better for that to enable that. But one of the things that it hasn't helped with is a convenient label that wraps all of that up in a bow.
yeah, yeah. Agreed. Like the other thing I like about it is once you start drawing boundaries, we just kind of touched on this before. You get into these semantic arguments of like, is that the thing or is it not the thing? And then when you like zoom way in, you'll find exceptions to the thing, and
Yeah,
but like if it's about if it's like a philosophy of trying to stay simpler, then the conversations are like, okay, we've zoomed way into this thing. How could I make that simpler? I feel like that's a more productive conversation rather than is it this thing?
yeah. I mean, I do agree. It's difficult for me because I work at a company where we've been very keen to promote an approach to building for the web. And that's not just about the architecture, that's about the workflow and all the rest of it.
Yep.
And so as things have gradually changed over time, a lot of these things have fit into this paradigm really nicely. When serverless functions arrived at Netlify, the same exact workflow was there. Same now with edge functions and all of these other tools and what have you. They fit into the same workflow, but the mental model and the architectural model is kind of shifting a little bit. And so that kind of takes me back to the what I was saying earlier on about conflating the workflow and the benefits with a descriptive term. So yeah, it's a very challenging one to just articulate very nicely. I think I used to use this term quite a lot, and people just frown at me when I said it. Around the internet, I used to talk about Jamstack and Jamstack adjacent technologies, and used to talk about edge functions as being Jamstack adjacent because they're the perfect thing to build on top of the Jamstack paradigm. Whether they fit into the same boxes or not, I don't know. If you wanted to make it all tidy, then yes, they definitely do. If you want to make it easy for people to comprehend and understand exactly what that paradigm is in the first place, don't put them in there, because the simpler something is, the easier it is for people to comprehend it in the first place. So kind of depends, I guess, on your intent and how you're trying to articulate these things. But the bigger something gets, the harder it is to to explain.
Yeah. No, that's the tension, eh? And then not making it so small that there's only 5 people who are interested in that very precise thing, and
which is kind of where it started. I mean, at the point that we were just describing static sites, then people were like, "Well, that's not compelling." You kind of have to add a bit more description to it and a bit more, a few more of the benefits and a few more of the characteristics to make it feel compelling, so that people, galvanize behind it. But I've been in so many conversations over the years of trying to articulate what is Jamstack and how should we talk about it now. I was kind of one of the main instigators behind the whole renaming Jamstack from capital JAM stack to Jamstack. And I mean, I've got in some conversations about that. But the intent of that was to try and make to shift the focus a little bit away from saying, well, a Jamstack site has to be JavaScript, has to be APIs, and it has to be markup, and it's a stack that may or may not have a capital S, but that's kind of moot. But the fact that you don't need JavaScript and you don't need APIs for something still to have these same characteristics and these same kind of fundamentals means that having an acronym there in the center was kind of a bit misleading. So anyway, I forget my point. I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole there. But the way that we label these things and describe them is difficult. That's where I was going. So I think the more language we attach to something, that doesn't necessarily make it clearer. I think the less we can talk about, the less it encompasses, the easier it is then for people to ascribe to or not.
Yeah.
Again, I keep on coming back to this. It's a file of folders, a folder of files.
Yeah. I think that avoids a lot of issue. Like, it's very easy to wrap your head around that. I like dropping the acronym, because I think that was confusing people. Like, okay, I have to have JavaScript and I have to have APIs. The like, one of the issues was that though is you don't get 100% of the community being like, oh, okay, this is the new term. Like,
I think we've got about 51% of the community, 51% of the people who voiced an opinion lent that way. But immediately it alienated a bunch of people. Hopefully it made it simpler, but I don't know. I mean, the road is kind of littered with places where we lost part of the community through, the complexity that was there, and naming is hard.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about the name. Like, the whole goal of this kind of movement is to get back to some of those core ideas that were initially there with the Jamstack. Do you think we can do that with the Jamstack name, or do we need a new name?
The honest answer is I don't know. I mean, what I would definitely say is that had we gone with a folder of files from the outset, we certainly wouldn't have got adoption, right? We wouldn't have the groundswell, because it's a lovely way of describing it now, but then I don't think it would have got us where we need to go. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of by the by. I think it did need a name to be able to kind of galvanize
Agreed. I don't think we'd be
people.
here without Jamstack.
I don't think so either. However, so it's very, whether we need a new term or not, I don't know. But what I would say is that the term is very loaded now, and it's very emotive. Rather, it's very emotive, because there are organizations that have got behind the idea of Jamstack and want to see the category grow. And I mean, like, I think Cloud Cannon are a great example of that, right? I mean, I think you ascribe very, very closely to that kind of model.
Yeah.
And Netlify always would talk internally, at least. I don't think this was really ever a secret, that success for us when it comes to Jamstack wouldn't be Netlify owning the Jamstack term and only being the only people who can operate in it. Actually, we wanted a category to blossom in which we could be a major player. Because without that category kind of growing and becoming very popular beyond us, that would be very, very limiting. So that was always the intent. However, as a result of that, and the result of being very closely associated with Jamstack, there are people who just assume that, well, Netlify want to own Jamstack. There are limits with Netlify, therefore there are limits with Jamstack, and vice versa. So you attack one, you attack the other. So I find myself I'm quite sensitive to that, because I've invested a lot of my own emotion in both of those two things, and I've seen a lot of attacks on the category by people who have other technical tastes. And there are lots of ways to build websites, and you should build in the way that suits you as an individual and your project. So use the thing you love, use the thing that's right for you.
That's it.
But people get very emotional, and they're like, well, this approach is bad, so everything about it is bad. And as a result, the name gets, the Jamstack term gets sullied, or people misunderstand it as well, which, we're definitely part of that. But it gets misunderstood, or it gets decided that it's bad. Some companies have taken an approach of wanting to look past it and say Jamstack is bad and we do something that's different to that, which again is fine. It's a marketing technique, and it's a positioning play. So as a result, I think that Jamstack as a term has got challenges, because it has to deal with all of that baggage now, because we've been through it together. There's been a lot that's happened.
Yeah.
So I honestly, I don't know. I think if we were to come up with another term between us and say that describes it perfectly, I don't know if that would be a step forward or a step back, if I'm very, very honest. I used to before I encountered the term Jamstack, I used to describe what I thought was the same thing as short stack. I say this is like a short stack approach. Trying to describe the fact that it shortens the stack of all of the technologies involved, because rather than having CDN and application server and database servers, you've just careful with that word, you limited it to things that can be served from a CDN. So it shortened the application stack. And so I used to describe it that way, but that never took off, and I didn't really make any effort to make it take off. It was descriptive to me. I think if we were to adopt that tomorrow, I don't think that would get any purchase at all. So I don't know. I'd love to be able to say, yeah, I think so, and I think these are the colors we should use in the logo for it. But I honestly don't know. What do you think? Do you think we should have a new term for that?
I'm split. Like,
yeah,
I to the same points that you have. I think Jamstack has done so much for the space, and just creating that umbrella. I think static sites would be a lot more niche if we didn't have Jamstack. But I agree with the baggage. And you were saying before, at each change, there was a good chunk of the community who was left behind, and it really makes it difficult to change it again, because you'll have people at each stage of the change being like, no, that's not what Jamstack means to me.
Yeah.
it's hard to like bring everyone on that journey. So that's where a new term is nice, is it's just fresh start, but then it doesn't have the kind of recognition that Jamstack does. So it's very much like building from scratch, and there's a good chance that that won't take and won't work. But it's just about that's kind of what this journey is about, I guess, is just figuring out what it is and what we call it.
Yeah. And yeah, I've seen lots of debate over the last few months of, is Jamstack dead? Is it over? And all of those things. And I think whenever I see that, I think to myself, well, the term is having a difficult time.
Yeah.
But the model that it's describing, I don't think it's ever been more popular. Even if it's been expanded on, and so it's the terminology that's difficult, and it's terminology and branding and aesthetics that people latch onto, which is kind of why technology is this cyclical thing, right? Because technologies come around again, but they describe something slightly different. Maybe they've evolved a little bit, but they get a new audience of people who are like, oh, that solves my problem that I'm having over here. It's like, yeah, well, we introduced those problems when we came round last,
Yeah.
So I think the approach has never been more vital, I would argue, even if the term itself is having a difficult time. I think that it's still incredibly compelling as the foundation for lots of things that we could put on top of that. Whether those are then, these adjacent technologies. I've got to stop using that term. It's just a terrible language. But the things
I don't
that we
have
can
anything better.
No, exactly. Yeah. So the enhancement. Let's talk about enhancements. So we can. I strongly believe that the most desirable way to build a site is the simplest way that you can do it. And if you can build things statically, I'm just kind of repeating myself, I guess. If we can build things statically as a Jamstack site, I would do that. But then if you want to add these layers of other things on top, wonderful. And I think we've got compelling tools to help us do that now. The thing I really want to advocate for is people being deliberate about it and choosing to do that because they've realized, oh, I need to add this layer on, rather than buying the minibus straight away, even if they don't, even if they're just, going out to get a latte in it. Oh God, this metaphor is failing awfully.
the latte in the minibus. I think that's a good note to finish on. And I think that's a good analogy for a lot of what's happening today. People are driving minibuses everywhere, getting their lattes.
Exactly. Yeah. Think about your gas bill.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, as you can tell, put a drink in my hand and get me in the corner of a room, and I'll talk about this for a very long time. So, I appreciate you humoring me and letting me spout for a while. It's very cathartic.
I love it. Thanks, Phil. Thanks for being here today. Great chat.
Nice one. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.